Mathis is 47 years old, with 25 years of experience and television's toughest judge. Jasmine is 32 years old, in her second term in Congress, and has never had any TV courtroom experience. On paper, it wasn't a fair competition. In reality, it wasn't either, but the winner was completely unexpected. The evening of May 18, 2025, began like any other taping day at the Judge Mathis Show studios in Chicago. The iconic courtroom set was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy, cameras being positioned, lighting adjusted, and the show's signature theme music echoing through the studio as technicians ran their final sound checks. Judge Greg Mathis, now in his 25th year of television jurisprudence, sat in his chambers reviewing the day's cases with his characteristic confidence. He had presided over more than 12,000 televised disputes, earning a reputation as one of daytime TV's most formidable legal minds. What Judge Mathis didn't know was that in exactly 73 minutes, his quarter-century reign as television's premier legal authority would face its most unexpected challenge. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had been invited as a special guest for what was supposed to be a light-hearted segment about the intersection of politics and law. The show's producers had envisioned a friendly conversation about legal reform, maybe some gentle sparring about constitutional interpretation. Nobody, not the producers, not the audience, and certainly not Judge Mathis himself, was prepared for what would become the most viral moment in daytime television legal history. Jasmine had arrived at the studio 3 hours early, not because she was nervous, but because she wanted to thoroughly understand the environment where she would soon find herself. She had spent the previous 6 weeks studying every aspect of Judge Mathis's television career, from his early episodes in 1999 to his most recent cases. She had analyzed his questioning techniques, his legal reasoning patterns, and most importantly, his tendency to underestimate opponents who didn't fit his preconceived notions of legal expertise. The setup for this confrontation had been building for months. During a March 2025 interview on CNN, Judge Mathis had made comments that would prove to be spectacularly ill-advised. When asked about young politicians who claimed legal expertise, he had specifically mentioned Jasmine Crockett as an example of someone who talks a good game, but probably couldn't handle a real courtroom if her political career depended on it. The comment had gone viral on social media, with hashtag Mathis vs. Crockett trending for 3 days. Legal commentators and political analysts had debated whether Mathis was right to question the practical legal skills of politicians who had transitioned from law to politics. Jasmine, characteristically, had remained silent during the controversy. But behind the scenes, her team had been working to arrange exactly the kind of confrontation that would settle the question once and for all. The show's segment featuring Jasmine was scheduled to be a standard 12-minute interview, positioned between 2 routine civil cases involving disputed car payments and landlord-tenant disagreements. Judge Mathis entered the studio at 6:47 p.m., his judicial robes immaculate, his demeanor radiating the authority that had made him a household name. At 47, he was at the peak of his television career, having successfully transitioned from a troubled youth in Detroit to a respected judge and media personality. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Mathis announced to the studio audience as cameras began rolling. Tonight we have a very special guest. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas has joined us to discuss the relationship between law and politics. Welcome to my courtroom, Congresswoman. Jasmine entered from the side door typically used by plaintiffs and defendants, wearing a sharp navy suit that conveyed both professionalism and confidence. At 32, she looked even younger than her years, which Judge Mathis had clearly counted on to reinforce his narrative about inexperienced politicians playing lawyer. Thank you for having me, Judge Mathis. It's an honor to be in your courtroom. Well, Congresswoman, I have to say I've been following your career with interest. Harvard Law School, civil rights practice, now Congress. Impressive resume on paper. But as I always tell folks, there's a big difference between knowing law in theory and practicing it in reality. The audience chuckled at what they interpreted as friendly banter, but Jasmine recognized the subtle challenge in Mathis's words. This was exactly the opening she had been hoping for. You're absolutely right, Judge Mathis. There is a significant difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. That's actually something I've been thinking about quite a bit since your comments on CNN about my legal capabilities. Judge Mathis's confident smile flickered slightly. He had made those comments months ago and hadn't expected them to be directly addressed on his own show. Well, Congresswoman, I hope you didn't take those comments personally. I was speaking generally about the difference between political rhetoric and courtroom reality. Not at all, Judge. In fact, I found your observations quite insightful. So much so that I've been wondering if you might be willing to put your theory to the test. The studio fell silent. This was definitely not the direction the producers had expected the interview to take. Judge Mathis leaned back in his chair, his judicial instincts suddenly alert. What exactly are you proposing, Congresswoman? Well, you've presided over thousands of cases on television. You've seen every type of legal argument, every variety of courtroom drama. I'm curious, do you think you could present me with a hypothetical case complex enough to demonstrate whether I can handle real courtroom situations? The challenge was now explicit. Judge Mathis found himself in a position he had never experienced in 25 years of television. A guest was challenging him to prove his own assertions about their legal incompetence. The audience sensed the tension and leaned forward in anticipation. Congresswoman, are you suggesting we conduct a mock trial right here on my show? I'm suggesting you give me your most challenging hypothetical case, one that would test every aspect of legal reasoning, evidence analysis, and courtroom strategy. If I fail to handle it competently, you'll have proven your point about politicians playing lawyer. If I succeed, she paused, letting the implications hang in the air. Judge Mathis was now fully engaged. His competitive instincts, honed by decades of courtroom battles both real and televised, had taken over. All right, Congresswoman, you want a real legal challenge? I'll give you one. But understand, this won't be some softball political debate. This will be the kind of complex case that separates real lawyers from people who just play them on TV. I wouldn't want it any other way, Judge. What happened next would be analyzed by legal scholars, television critics, and political commentators for years to come. Judge Mathis spent the next 4 minutes constructing what he believed was an impossibly complex hypothetical case. A multi-party contract dispute involving international law, intellectual property rights, environmental regulations, and criminal conspiracy charges. Here's your case, Congresswoman. Judge Mathis began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been intellectually challenged on his own show. Tech Global Industries, a multinational corporation, has entered into a joint venture with Eco Solutions, an environmental consulting firm, to develop a new water purification system. The technology was originally developed by Dr. Sarah Chun, a Chinese-American scientist, while she was employed by Tech Global. He continued building the complexity. Dr. Chin claims the technology was stolen from her previous research at MIT, which was funded by a federal grant. Eco Solutions has already begun marketing the technology in 17 countries, generating $340 million in revenue. However, the EPA has discovered that the purification process produces a toxic byproduct that may have contaminated water supplies in 3 states. The case got even more intricate. Meanwhile, the FBI has opened an investigation into whether Tech Global executives bribed foreign officials to secure international contracts for the technology. Dr. Chun is suing for intellectual property theft. Tech Global is suing Eco Solutions for breach of contract. The EPA is seeking criminal charges for environmental violations, and affected communities are filing class action lawsuits for damages. Judge Mathis concluded with obvious satisfaction. You're representing Dr. Chun. You have 45 minutes to present your case, including opening statement, evidence presentation, and closing argument. You must address the intellectual property claims, the federal grant complications, the environmental liabilities, the international law implications, and the criminal conspiracy allegations. Oh, and by the way, Tech Global's defense team includes 3 of the country's top corporate attorneys. The studio audience was completely silent. Even the production crew had stopped what they were doing to watch. Judge Mathis had constructed a case so complex that it would challenge experienced trial attorneys with teams of researchers and months of preparation. He was asking Jasmine to handle it alone, impromptu, in less than an hour. Is that challenging enough for you, Congresswoman? Jasmine stood up from the guest chair and walked toward the center of the studio, where a makeshift attorney's podium had been quickly set up. Her movement was deliberate and confident, showing no sign of being overwhelmed by the case's complexity. Your Honor, before I begin my opening statement, I'd like to thank you for constructing such a fascinating case. It perfectly illustrates why most attorneys avoid cases with this level of complexity, not because they're intellectually challenging, but because they're usually poorly structured from a strategic standpoint. Judge Mathis's eyebrows rose. This was not the response he had expected. I'm sorry, are you suggesting my hypothetical case is poorly constructed? Not poorly constructed, Your Honor, but strategically unfocused. What you've presented isn't really one case. It's 6 separate legal actions that happen to involve related parties. The key to winning Dr. Chen's case isn't trying to address all 6 issues simultaneously. It's identifying which legal theory provides the strongest foundation for victory and building everything else around that central argument. She moved to a whiteboard that the production crew had wheeled onto the set. May I demonstrate, Your Honor? Please proceed, Counselor. Judge Mathis's tone had shifted slightly. He was no longer the confident television personality challenging a politician. He was becoming genuinely curious about where this was heading. The conventional approach to this case would be to treat each legal issue separately. Intellectual property in one argument, environmental liability in another, federal grant compliance in a third, and so on. But that approach virtually guarantees failure because it allows the defense to fragment our case and force us to fight on 6 different fronts simultaneously. Jasmine began drawing connections on the whiteboard that Judge Mathis hadn't considered. Instead, we build our entire case around a single, unifying legal theory, that Tech Global engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud that touches every aspect of this dispute. She outlined her strategy with surgical precision. We argue that Tech Global didn't just steal Dr. Chen's intellectual property. They knowingly stole technology that violated her federal grant obligations, knowingly marketed it without proper environmental testing, and knowingly used criminal conspiracy to cover up these violations. The studio audience was now completely captivated. What had started as a challenge to embarrass a young politician was becoming a masterclass in legal strategy. This unified approach transforms 6 weak cases into one overwhelmingly strong case. Jasmine continued. Instead of trying to prove intellectual property theft in isolation, we prove it as part of a broader pattern of criminal fraud. Instead of fighting environmental liability as a separate issue, we show it as evidence of Tech Global's knowing disregard for legal requirements. Judge Mathis was now taking notes. In 25 years of television jurisprudence, he had never seen anyone approach a complex case from this angle. But here's the brilliant part of this strategy, Your Honor, Jasmine said, moving to what would become the most quoted portion of her presentation. When we unify these separate legal issues under a fraud theory, we don't just strengthen Dr. Chen's case. We create a legal framework that actually helps resolve all 6 related cases simultaneously. She turned to face Judge Mathis directly. The EPA's environmental investigation becomes evidence supporting our fraud claims. The FBI's criminal investigation provides additional proof of systematic wrongdoing. The class action lawsuits demonstrate the scope of damages caused by Tech Global's fraudulent conduct. Instead of 6 separate legal battles, we now have 6 different sources of evidence all pointing toward the same conclusion. Tech Global is a criminal enterprise that has violated federal law, international law, environmental law, and intellectual property law as part of a coordinated pattern of fraud. The transformation in the studio was palpable. Judge Mathis was no longer challenging Jasmine. He was learning from her. The audience had stopped seeing this as entertainment and started recognizing they were witnessing something historically significant. Now, for the opening statement, Jasmine announced, moving to the position where attorneys typically address juries in Judge Mathis's courtroom. What followed was 23 minutes of legal argumentation that would be studied in law schools for decades. Jasmine didn't just present Dr. Chen's case. She deconstructed and rebuilt the entire legal framework surrounding intellectual property theft in the context of federal grant obligations and international criminal conspiracy. She began with a hook that immediately captured attention. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case isn't about a dispute between scientists and corporations. This case is about whether criminal enterprises can use the complexity of modern technology to hide systematic fraud from the American people. Her narrative was flawless. Dr. Sarah Chun didn't just invent a water purification system. She developed a technology that could revolutionize how the world addresses water scarcity and environmental contamination. She did this work while employed by Tech Global, using facilities and resources provided by federal grants designed to advance American technological leadership. Jasmine continued building her case. Tech Global executives knew that Dr. Chen's federal grant agreements required that any resulting technology be used for the public benefit. They knew that environmental testing was required before international marketing. They knew that proper intellectual property attribution was legally mandated. But instead of following the law, Tech Global chose to steal Dr. Chen's technology, hide its environmental dangers, falsify its testing data, and bribe foreign officials to secure contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The evidence presentation that followed was even more impressive. Jasmine constructed hypothetical documents, witness testimonies, and expert analyses that not only proved Dr. Chen's case, but anticipated and neutralized every defense argument Tech Global might present. The defense will argue that Dr. Chen developed this technology as a Tech Global employee, making it corporate property, Jasmine predicted. But federal grant law is clear. When taxpayer money funds research, the resulting intellectual property belongs to the American people, not to private corporations. The defense will claim they didn't know about environmental dangers, she continued. But we have internal emails showing that Tech Global executives discussed these risks 18 months before beginning international marketing. The defense will argue that foreign business practices don't constitute criminal conspiracy under U.S. law. But when American corporations use foreign bribery to market stolen technology that violates federal environmental standards, every aspect of that operation becomes subject to U.S. criminal jurisdiction. Judge Mathis was now completely absorbed in Jasmine's presentation. His initial skepticism had transformed into professional admiration, then amazement, and finally something approaching awe. The closing argument was devastating in its effectiveness. Jasmine tied together every element of the complex case into a coherent narrative that made Tech Global's guilt seem not just probable, but inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Chen could have developed her technology privately and become wealthy selling it to the highest bidder. Instead, she chose to work on federally funded research because she believed American innovation should serve the global public good. Tech Global stole that technology, violated that public trust, endangered public health, and corrupted international markets, all for private profit. They didn't just commit theft. They didn't just violate environmental law. They didn't just engage in criminal conspiracy. They attacked the very foundations of publicly funded research and international legal cooperation. Her conclusion was perfect. When you return your verdict, you're not just deciding Dr. Chen's case. You're deciding whether criminal enterprises can use legal complexity to hide systematic fraud. You're deciding whether American innovation serves American values or American greed. You're deciding whether the law protects honest scientists or criminal corporations. I trust you'll make the right decision. The studio erupted in spontaneous applause that lasted over 2 minutes. Judge Mathis sat in stunned silence, clearly trying to process what he had just witnessed. The case he had designed to demonstrate the limits of political legal knowledge had instead showcased a level of legal sophistication that exceeded anything he had seen in his quarter-century television career. When the applause finally died down, Judge Mathis spoke slowly and deliberately. Congresswoman Crockett, in 25 years of presiding over legal disputes, I have never, and I mean never, seen a more comprehensive, strategically brilliant, or persuasively presented case. He paused, clearly struggling with what to say next. I owe you an apology. I owe my audience an apology. And I owe every viewer who heard my original comments about your legal capabilities a public apology. What you just demonstrated wasn't just competent legal advocacy. It was legal genius. You took a case I specifically designed to be impossibly complex and not only solved it. You solved it in a way that was more sophisticated than approaches I've seen from attorneys with decades of trial experience. The audience gave another standing ovation, but Judge Mathis held up his hand. I'm not finished. Congresswoman, what you've shown here tonight changes how I think about the relationship between politics and law, between theoretical knowledge and practical application, and between experience and wisdom. He looked directly at the cameras. To everyone watching, what we've witnessed tonight is why America needs more people like Jasmine Crockett in positions of leadership. Her legal mind isn't just sharp, it's revolutionary. The segment that was supposed to last 12 minutes had stretched to 47 minutes. The show's producers, initially concerned about going over time, were now frantically calling the network to extend the broadcast. They knew they were capturing television history. As the show concluded, Judge Mathis made an unprecedented offer. "Congresswoman, if you ever decide to leave politics, I would be honored to have you as co-host of this show. In fact, I think I might learn more from you than you would from me." Jasmine's response was gracious but firm. "Thank you, Judge Mathis, but my legal skills are needed in Congress right now. There are real cases to solve there. Cases involving justice, accountability, and the rule of law. But I hope what we've demonstrated tonight is that legal excellence can exist anywhere people are willing to pursue it with dedication and integrity." Within 6 hours of the show's broadcast, video clips of Jasmine's mock trial presentation were viral across every social media platform. Hashtag Mathis versus Crockett was trending again, but this time the conversation was completely different. Legal commentators were calling it the most impressive display of legal reasoning ever captured on television. Harvard Law School requested permission to use the footage in their trial advocacy courses. The American Bar Association invited Jasmine to present a CLE seminar on strategic case construction. 3 major networks offered her legal commentary positions. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after the show aired, Judge Mathis appeared on CNN to discuss the viral moment. When asked about his initial comments questioning Jasmine's legal abilities, his response was remarkable. "I made those comments because I confused experience with wisdom, credentials with capability, and seniority with sophistication. Jasmine Crockett taught me that legal genius isn't about how long you've been practicing law. It's about how deeply you understand what law is supposed to accomplish." What she demonstrated on my show wasn't just legal skill. It was legal vision. She didn't just solve a complex case. She showed a better way to think about complex cases. That's not something you learn from experience. That's something you're born with and develop through dedication to excellence. The interview concluded with Judge Mathis making a prediction that would prove remarkably prescient. "Mark my words, Jasmine Crockett's approach to legal reasoning will change how law is taught and practiced in America. What we saw on my show was the future of American jurisprudence." 6 months later, the Crockett Method, the strategic approach to complex litigation that Jasmine had demonstrated, was being taught in law schools across the country. Legal scholars had published dozens of articles analyzing her techniques. Trial attorneys were incorporating her strategies into their own practice. 1 year after the show aired, when Jasmine was invited to deliver the keynote address at the American Law Institute's annual conference, she reflected on the unexpected impact of her television appearance. "Judge Mathis challenged me to prove that politicians could handle real legal work. What I discovered was that the question itself was backwards. The real question isn't whether politicians can handle legal work. It's whether our legal system is prepared to embrace the kind of innovative thinking that comes from people who understand law as a tool for social progress rather than just professional advancement. The law isn't a game to be won by the most experienced players. It's a framework for justice to be advanced by the most committed advocates." Judge Mathis taught me that when he gave me the opportunity to demonstrate what legal advocacy could look like when it's driven by purpose rather than just precedent. The standing ovation that followed lasted for over 4 minutes. Unprecedented for the usually staid legal academic audience. But then again, what Jasmine Crockett had accomplished on Judge Mathis's show was itself unprecedented. She had transformed a challenge designed to expose her limitations into a demonstration that redefined what legal excellence could look like in the modern era. The young congresswoman who was supposed to be embarrassed by her lack of TV courtroom experience had instead created a new standard for legal reasoning that would influence American jurisprudence for generations to come. And it all started with a 47-year-old television judge who thought he knew the difference between real lawyers and people who just played them on TV.